You're watching a Gravitas special edition, and we are focusing on the BRICS summit that will be underway tomorrow. Days after diffusing tensions over the Doklam plateau, Prime Minister Modi will deliberate with his host China's President Xi Jinping at the summit in Xiamen. The Chinese have waved the red flag on terrorism in Pakistan, and India is yet to reveal its cards. But geopolitical shifts will raise many questions about BRICS. Here's a report on what to expect.
Ahead of the 9th BRICS summit, which opens in China on Monday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry sent India a not-so-subtle warning about raising issues like Pakistan and terrorism during the BRICS deliberations. We have taken note of the concerns of the Indian side on counter-terrorism issues of Pakistan, but I don't believe that it should feature prominently during the Xiamen summit. Will Prime Minister Modi go along is the million-dollar question. Will India-China tensions over Doklam resonate at the summit is another. The sense is that Doklam will be dealt with separately, but terrorism in Pakistan are key concerns for India, and Russia moving closer to China's view in Islamabad complicates India's position. One Belt, One Road, or OBOR, is another likely area of friction. India could reiterate its view that the program should be transparent and sustainable. It will not allow OBOR, which it perceives as a route for dumping Chinese goods in India. That view could go against the current thinking among other BRICS members.
China has been leading the campaign on the One Belt, One Roads initiative, which has a direct result of improving the countries that are involved in it. And therefore, part of the BRICS agenda is infrastructure development, which ties in very well with the goals of One Belt, One Road. So China is very much equipped to lead us in this process of common development within the BRICS nation.
There could be common ground on climate change and renewable energy, consensus on a BRICS credit rating agency, and accord on more intra-BRICS economic cooperation and people-to-people collaboration.
I think BRICS is needed by the world because otherwise we have a unipolar world dominated by the U.S. dictating to the rest of the world how it should trade, how it should interact, what its military and political policy. BRICS represents a counter-hegemonic force, at least embryonically, at least in its potential.
The summit will be an interesting platform to study the geopolitical shifts underway. Russia and China together at odds with the US and out of sync with neighbors in Southeast Asia, while India appears to be moving closer to the United States and building new alliances in Asia. Bureau Report, WION.
Well, the summit gets underway on Monday with the theme of stronger partnership for a brighter future. But the North Korean hydrogen bomb test may dilute the focus of this summit. This is what's on the agenda. It will look to strengthen its image as open to trade and committed to globalization. Expect a strong focus on trade and investment issues. There's talk of setting up a BRICS credit rating agency on the lines of Moody's and others in the West, enhancing cooperation among the members on climate change and renewable energy. The summit is also expected to take up for discussion the expansion of the group with the admission of new members. Joining me this evening, Padma Rao, Senior Foreign Editor, with me in the studio. Arun Singh, former Ambassador to the US, also with me in the studio. Dr. Sriram Chaulia, Professor and Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. And we will have our very own Ramesh Ramachandran, International Correspondent, bringing you live reports and the latest from Xiamen in China. Good evening to all of you. Ramesh, let's begin with you because you're on the ground there. What's the buzz?
Well, to begin with, Palki, Prime Minister Modi has arrived in Xiamen, and as was earlier expected, he will not meet with President Xi Jinping tomorrow, but on the concluding day of the BRICS summit, that is on the 5th of September, that is day after tomorrow. But that said, the expectation here among at least the Chinese media is what does India expect from the bilateral meeting between Indian and Chinese leaders? And that is the buzz that I'm picking up from talking to a cross-section of the Chinese media who have gathered here in Xiamen for the 9th BRICS summit.
Right. Arun Singh, it started as an economic forum. What is BRICS about today and what's in it for India? What can we expect?
So I think from India's point of view, there's a lot to expect from the summit. In itself, a meeting of 5 major countries, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa and India, accounting for more than 40% of the world's population, 23% of the world's GDP, 17% of the global trade, and more than 50% of the growth taking place in the world over the last several years, and spanning the continents of Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, is in itself significant. The second important aspect is that there is a visit of the Indian Prime Minister taking place to China for this summit so soon after the resolving of the differences over Doklam. So it will be watched very closely as to how the two handled the differences that were there and lay the path going forward. BRICS also, as some of the commentary has pointed out, was set up in 2009 in the context of the global financial crisis of 2008. And therefore it played an important role in bringing the voice of non-Western countries on global financial and economic issues, trade issues, climate change, terrorism, and their coordination in the framework of the meetings of the G20, of the United Nations, and also handling some issues related to regional political challenges. So in today's context, with major international changes taking place, major changes in the international order, where China's strength has been rising, economic and military, the US seems to be in somewhat of a retreat in the international context, then some of the critical regional issues of today, and today we had the incident related to North Korea of a major nuclear test. What happens on Afghanistan? What comes out, the message that comes out on Syria? On climate change, where US has pulled out from the Paris Agreement, or on trade issues, because the message coming out from the US is one of protectionism. So the common voice that these countries bring to bear on these issues would be critical. And the final point, that each of the countries that are assembling today have different levels of relationship with the US and Europe and the West. Russia has a difficult relationship today. It is under sanctions. The West has challenges with China on South China Sea, on trade. At the same time, the Chinese economy and Western economies are deeply integrated. And India has been building a closer relationship now with US and Europe. So with these differences, yet how are these countries able to come together with a common position and strengthen multipolarity, so that it moves away from a unipolar world, which again is in India's interest. So I think with all these aspects, the summit does acquire a lot of significance for India.
Padma, for a majority of the observers here in India, the highlight will be a meeting between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. Should the world be holding its breath on what's to come?
I think the world should be heaving a sigh of relief, as most Indians will be too, because it is a photo. It's a sort of a photo opportunity, photo finish moment. There was such a lot of heated rhetoric coming out of both the countries that I think all eyes will certainly be on that meeting. Some of it will be overshadowed by the events in North Korea, as Ambassador Singh just pointed out. But I do feel that this is not only an opportunity as a photo opportunity for the two leaders of China and India to meet, but also things have not been hunky-dory between India and Russia, for instance, over Russia's, coming somewhat closer to Pakistan than ever before, its delivery of helicopters to Pakistan. So I think, in that sense, it will also be a photo opportunity when President Vladimir Putin meets Prime Minister Modi, and to see all these five very divergent nations together, at least divergent on many other platforms, come together on a common stage is bound to be a sort of an uplifting moment for people who've been watching it anxiously.
Dr. Sriram Cholia, you've been writing about what to expect and why the summit is very important. Tell us more.
I think the Chinese hosts have been talking about completing one golden decade of the BRICS cooperation process, which is dated back to 2006-2007. I think it's a kind of a landmark in that sense that we've completed about 10 years, although this is only the 9th summit. And I think the fact that they have stuck together, despite these divergences in the nature of their economies, their foreign policies, and the different regions they inhabit, it's a very unique institution that has served the interests of all the member states and aspires to also show a leading light to the rest of the developing world. So I think BRICS as a kind of an avant-garde for the global south, that idea although it's still work in progress, is important to bear in mind, because remember, we have like the G77 process in the UN where there are more than 120 countries. And for most of them, BRICS is supposedly some kind of like a lighthouse, showing them the path to cooperate and also spreading public goods like BRICS Development Bank, supporting projects not just among member countries, but eventually to the rest of them. So I think this is a great hope for many of us who in the developing world who have believed in the idea of South-South cooperation, but who mostly spoke about solidarity in a political sense, but could not deliver economic benefits to our people. So I think BRICS is slowly but surely heading in that direction. That's one. The second point is I want to mention the security aspects. You spoke about how the Chinese have been objecting to India raising the Pakistan issue here in BRICS and so on. But remember, there are important security mechanisms. At least aspirationally, BRICS wants to form a joint position on countering terrorism, which is more rhetorical and unfortunately has not translated into reality because of the narrow nationalistic perceptions of, especially of China and India, while I think the rest are more or less unanimous on opposing terrorism. Just see what President Xi Jinping just said at the convention, at the opening speech a few hours ago. He said, we believe in a holistic approach to countering terrorism, and by which he means, and he says, we should look at the root causes, which is, of course, going down the line of the Pakistani position, which is that, India is oppressing people in Kashmir, and therefore there is insurgency and terrorism in against India. So I think, but when it comes to Xinjiang, for example, the Chinese will not accept there is any root cause. So at the end of the day, there are a lot of these particularistic interests that are clashing and conflicting. So we need to overcome this. There is a national security advisor level dialogue. They are talking about finding a common position on global hotspots, which I'm not sure, again, all of them share. So, for example, if Venezuela is going through crisis, we are not sure what Brazil's view is and how the others can support it. So I have always believed that that BRICS should form a system where we should give each of the member countries a kind of a pilot role in their respective regions, and the rest of the members, the remaining four, should support that pilot country's position and aid in resolution of crises. That's something, again, it's work in the progress, it's in the pipelines. I hope in the future, be it North Korea or Venezuela or the Democratic Republic of Congo, BRICS should come up with a common position that will make it a weightier player in the global power politics and not just in economics.
Right. We'll dwell on these subjects a bit more. I'm going to request you all to stay with me and let's talk to our viewers about what BRICS has achieved in the 9 summits so far. The jury is still out on this one, but the pundits say that BRICS challenges and the existing global and economic, that BRICS does challenge the global economic and political order. It is a platform for developing countries to address issues important to them. BRICS has helped them win a greater say in the IMF and the World Bank. BRICS' new development bank is a major success, according to experts, announcing $1.4 billion in loans for sustainable development projects in China, India and Russia. BRICS has brought together countries that otherwise have little connect with each other, for example, Brazil and China or Brazil and India. It gives India and China a neutral platform to talk to each other about bilateral issues, including tensions. As we saw, the BRICS card was played on the Doklam issue. Arun Singh, it is, as I said, started as an economic one, but economically some of the BRICS nations aren't in very good shape. So has there been any tangible progress, according to you, in the past 9 years?
So I think there has been a lot of tangible progress, and you yourself mentioned in your comments about the setting up of the new development bank. And the bank has started functioning. It has already given loans worth about $1.5 billion. And indications are that another $2.5 to $3 billion worth of loans may be also finalized soon. Similarly, the contingency reserve arrangement has been established, which is an additional mechanism for the countries concerned to tap local currency requirements in case of a crisis. So these are important developments. Also, again, as you mentioned, that some of the links between the countries are so far not very well established. With China, for example, China is the largest trading partner in goods. So there is an imbalance, but it's the largest trading partner in goods. So there is a link. But wherever the links are not there, the countries have been working to set up institutional mechanisms to start developing the links. For example, a BRICS Business Council has been set up, which brings together the business people from the countries concerned to start building up these relationships. So these efforts are being made, issues related to health, energy. The national security advisors meet from time to time. So mechanisms have been put in place to strengthen the linkages. So I think we should give it an opportunity for all of this to develop over time. And also the countries and the BRICS have started outreach mechanisms, to which Dr. Cholia also had referred, where Brazil had invited Latin American countries, South Africa had invited African countries, India had invited the BIMSTEC countries. So different ways are being worked out to enhance the outreach to emerging market and developing countries.
Padma, would you say that bilateral issues have put brakes on the multilateral forum that BRICS was meant to have been?
Well, if they have, then I think I also see a growing similarity between what BRICS, is clearly spelling out as its chief, let's say, goal, which is anti-protectionism. I heard similar strains from Prime Minister Modi as well as from German Chancellor Angela Merkel in Hamburg at the G20 summit. So I think there is a common ground there between the European Union as an economic entity. Perhaps the BRICS has a lot to learn or can learn from the EU. Having said that, on the other hand, I fear that perhaps some of the, the reasons why the European Union has not succeeded as a political entity, and also even as an economic entity, because these are individual countries like France and Germany, the two big economies that are, together in the Union, but they're also competing against each other. For instance, over the Eurofighter sale to India, the Dassault Rafale. So you had a very peculiar situation where you had France and Germany as the chief members of the European Union, but competing in, to sell aircraft in India. So I'm looking at that as a model and wondering whether BRICS could overcome that, because let's not forget that the rifts and rivalries, as you mentioned, are far, far deeper within certain countries in BRICS, for instance, India and China, both of whom are also fierce competitors in very many markets, notably in Africa. So, that will be a hurdle to overcome. I'm sure Ambassador Singh would be the better person to answer this question because he is an economist. But looking at the political rifts, I do fear that some of these rifts are so deep and so long. I mean, they've just been, been around for so long that they may take that much longer to actually create, sort of a viable entity out of BRICS.
If I could just supplement that to say that although there are differences among BRICS countries, other groupings also have differences. So if you look at US and Europe, and they are in the nature of an alliance, even there are differences between US and Germany, between Germany and France, between Germany and Greece, within the European Union or within the Eurozone. So one should accept that even within groupings, there will be differences because no two countries have exactly the same national interests and concerns. So, but we have to see that despite these differences, what are the points of convergence where they can work together to maximize their interest?
Right. Sriram Cholia, how do you think BRICS as a forum compares to other similar structures, and do you believe that it has the potential to become a political force given the kind of differences that the member countries have?
Well, BRICS is incomparable because it's an intercontinental formation. It's not a regional organization like the EU or ASEAN or Mercosur. So in that sense, it's bringing together, knitting together the whole idea of the global south, the entire southern hemisphere, so to say. So in that sense, if you look at Brazil, for example, or South Africa, because they don't share any territorial boundaries with the rest of the three members, and are in a different geopolitical space, it creates opportunities for, thinking through some of the more idealistic principles of shared values as developing countries, as former colonial countries, as countries that aspire to change the, the polarity in the global international system itself. So in that sense, BRICS is unique. But yes, we can certainly pick up, as Padma is saying, learn from others how to manage our individual differences and how to construct a common agenda. I mean, that remains, I think, the biggest challenge always, as I was mentioning on the case of terrorism. But I would suggest that, we should also look at other issues. There has been, for a long time, the Russians have been wanting to create a BRICS energy bank or an energy union because there are countries like Brazil and Russia are energy surplus. while South Africa, India, and China are actually energy buyers in the global markets. So on the other hand, for renewables, the New Development Bank has been pushing in a big way. And I think these are the concrete areas where if we can deliver, I think all the skeptics will be, answered. What has not happened and something that needs to happen further is global economic governance. There's been a lot of talk about how BRICS are changing or pushing the Bretton Woods institutions and moving them in a more equitable direction, increasing their voting shares and their percentages in all these bodies. But at the same time, we know that these are primarily still Western controlled. Therefore, ultimately BRICS and other such formations, the outreach is important, what Ambassador mentioned, because if we can bring in 4 or 5 other countries, I know this is a consensus-driven process, it's going to take a while, but eventually it has to be BRICS plus. So I am not so suspicious of the Chinese move on this aspect that somehow BRICS plus is going to benefit the Chinese, because if they bring in, even look at the countries they've invited for this summit, Egypt, it's a very solid, it's always been supportive of India's position on a number of issues, and so on. So I'm trying to say that we need to bring in more energy and more dynamism from different continents to make this a viable international, truly global project. Bring in 1 or 2 from each of the continents, and that's going to make a substantial difference to our agenda and to our, collective strength. Because ultimately, multipolarity will come only by joining hands. When weaker and smaller countries come together, that's only we can really challenge the more established ones.
Then the question is, who qualifies? Ramesh, where does expanding BRICS figure on the agenda, and what does it entail?
Well, clearly, Palki, it's been 17 years since BRICS was first conceptualized, and the first summit took place, as we were discussing, in the year 2009. So we've almost nearing 1 decade of BRICS' formal existence, and I think the Xiamen summit can be expected to set the pace or the agenda for the next 10 years, or the second decade of the BRICS existence. And to my mind, the pattern, the trend towards the outreach to other countries, especially in every member state's neighborhood, is a welcome trend, and we are seeing here 5 countries being invited to the 9th summit here in Xiamen, including Mexico, Tajikistan from Central Asia, 2 African countries, Egypt and Guinea, and also the Southeast Asian economy of Thailand. So BRICS Plus is a very ambitious agenda, especially the Chinese are piloting that the theme of BRICS Plus. And to my mind, that is the shape of things to come within the BRICS, the ambit of the BRICS. But that said, as we've been discussing here on WION, there are internal, differences within the BRICS countries which need to be resolved. And one way of going forward is to add more political heft to the discussions here, and not just focus purely on the economic component of the BRICS relationship. And to my mind, that might be something that BRICS countries might want to explore going forward as well.
And that leads me to the next question. Pakistan, which I'm assuming is going to come up in talks not just with China but also with Russia.
Mm-hmm. So it's inevitable that in the discussions there, Prime Minister will raise our concerns related to terrorism and the safe haven for terrorist groups operating from Pakistan. So that is bound to come up, and our point of view would be conveyed. One can expect that in the joint statement that comes out, perhaps this kind of a specific reference may not be there. It was not there at the Goa summit either, because a joint statement is like a consensus position. But our concerns will certainly be conveyed in the discussions, perhaps even in public comments.
Padma, your thoughts on this? And do you believe China really cares for something like BRICS? Because I remember reading someone said that they want a G2 now. They think they're at par with the US. And while they may be a member of BRICS, their ambitions are much bigger.
Well, China certainly seems to care for BRICS, going by this report I read in a German newspaper that, it's already, the countries, for instance, there are 10 Chinese companies that have already invested or are on the verge of investment in one or the other of the BRICS countries. Very quickly, there's Sinopec, which has bought parts of Chevron in Africa. Then, there's the China Investment Corporation, which has bought 90% of shares in a gas pipeline in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So I think the Chinese are looking at it also as an opportunity, obviously to further their interests in all the other countries. And if you look at the economies of you look at the economy of South Africa, I mean, it's growing at its growth rate is 1%. If you look at the political instability in Brazil, you know, there's a very weak president in place. He's trying to introduce very controversial reforms. There is a danger that he might be impeached. So many of the, you know, promises and commitments he makes at this summit, he may not be able to follow through on. But to come back to Pakistan, you know, two things. One, I do feel that North Korea is likely to be the dominant subject. And there again, China and India are likely to find common ground, at least in the public statement and the public face. On the other hand, India has expressed that very clearly in her statement today in reacting to the North Korean test about the security situation, raised concerns about immediate security in the South Asian region, and it was very, very clear what South Bloc meant by that. And you know, and China has had a sort of on and off, or face-on, face-off relationship with North Korea. So nobody really knows on which side the Chinese stand as far as North Korea is concerned.
Right.
Sure, they've made public noises today, but we really don't know, you know, what kind of a relationship, the nature of their true relationship with North Korea.
Absolutely.